Over the last decade, corporate output maximized itself through sheer velocity. Offices operated on a perpetual cycle of acceleration, demanding a pace that treated human endurance as an infinite resource. This environment gave rise to hustle culture. It operated as an invisible expectation, a mandate that employees prove their worth through continuous, progressive productivity at the expense of human rest. But the incoming workforce, millennials and Generation Z, observed the burnout of their predecessors. In response, they are actively rejecting the premise that professional success requires total personal sacrifice. This cultural shift is defined as the soft life. It represents a deliberate prioritization of mental bandwidth, emotional sustainability, and strict professional boundaries. Inside the corporate ecosystem, this boundary setting manifests as a phenomenon widely labeled quiet quitting. Technically, this is quiet distancing, a process of retaining the job while disconnecting from the corporate ownership mindset. Mechanically, quiet distancing is absolute contractual compliance. Employees execute the precise requirements outlined in their job descriptions and aggressively withhold any uncompensated discretionary effort. The previous era of work relied on an informal contract of voluntary overachievement. The new labor pool has unilaterally voided that agreement. Organizations engineered to operate at 120% capacity are suddenly dropping to exactly 100%. This calibration has triggered immediate executive panic. The reflexive response for management is to treat this withdrawal of excess labor as actionable underperformance, viewing a refusal to overachieve as a breach of professional duty. Management is operating under the assumptions of the informal contract, the invisible addendums hidden beneath the actual paperwork, demanding constant availability and unpaid overtime. Facing a drop in output, employers are now actively attempting to use formal labor laws to enforce these informal cultural expectations. This creates a structural conflict. Can an employer legally sanction or terminate an employee for refusing to exceed their baseline contractual duties? Scrutinized under strict statutory civil labor law, the quiet quitter occupies a position that is difficult for management to penetrate legally. Terminating an employee for meeting only the minimum requirements of their contract introduces significant legal complexities for the organization. To understand why, we will put quiet distancing through a series of strict legal stress tests to determine if it meets the requirements for termination. We begin with employment law's primary mechanism, the fundamental obligation to perform work. Under frameworks like the Hungarian Labor Code, the employee must work with reasonable care. The quiet quitter deliberately aims for the lowest acceptable tier of performance intensity, delivering the minimum viable product. Friction arises here. The employer expects the employee to operate at the absolute top of the scale, but the law only guarantees the middle. This creates a legal paradox. The worker's output is frustratingly low by modern corporate standards, yet strictly compliant with the letter of the law. Because the explicit contractual duties are met, the baseline reasonable care threshold is satisfied. The first grounds for dismissal are neutralized. Management typically counters this by asserting their authority. As the employer, they possess the unilateral power to determine the exact method and standard of performance. But that power is restrained by a strict legal limitation, the principle of equitable assessment. This principle dictates that a unilateral directive cannot cause an unreasonable disadvantage to the employee's private life. Demanding continuous progressivity, extreme urgency, or uncompensated after-hours availability violates this balance. The informal expectation of maximum performance inherently conflicts with the statutory protection of the worker's right to disconnect. An employer's unilateral demand for hustle becomes legally unenforceable the moment it infringes upon the boundaries of an employee's private time. The next available legal vector involves general standards of conduct, specifically the principles of good faith, fairness, and the protection of the employer's economic interests. A desperate employer might argue that an employee deliberately working at a lower intensity constitutes an act against the company's legitimate economic interests. If a worker joins the quiet quitting trend with explicit documented intent to force a termination and extract severance, that would breach good faith. But proving internal intent without a confession is nearly impossible. Categorizing contractual compliance as an economic threat would create a significant shift in how all labor agreements are interpreted. Establishing such a precedent would leave employees inherently vulnerable, effectively requiring them to constantly overperform simply to maintain basic job security. Legislative trends and case law actively prioritize work-life balance. Courts will not weaponize the good faith clause to legally mandate maximum corporate output. This leaves the final and most common managerial reflex, attempting to terminate the relationship based on a loss of confidence or loss of trust. The flaw in this approach is that subjective managerial frustration over an employee's lack of passion is legally irrelevant. This chart shows performance data mapped over time, illustrating a precedent set by Hungarian case law. It proves that a termination related to employee ability requires objective, undeniable proof. The burden of proof rests entirely on the employer. They must provide documented evidence of continuous underperformance. Furthermore, the underperformance must be significantly inferior compared to other employees, a standard that carefully calibrated quiet quitter avoids. Loss of confidence cannot be invoked for prolonged, accepted behavior. If the employer tolerates quiet distancing for months, the legal window for termination closes. Unless management possesses continuous, peer-reviewed data of objective failure, a loss of trust termination will collapse in litigation. The quiet quitter has moved through the legal system by maintaining absolute compliance. The challenge has shifted from a legal dispute to one of organizational architecture. Punishing the soft life through the legal system is a failed strategy. The managerial tools of the hustle era are obsolete. Managing the soft life is a challenge of organizational design. Viewed as a failure of human resources management, quiet quitting requires a cultural rather than a punitive response. The necessary update in management begins with limiting the time of employer instruction and strictly enforcing the employee's right to disconnect. It also necessitates empathetic management. The incoming workforce requires explicit validation to counter the toxic never-enough mindset ingrained by hustle culture. But the ultimate structural solution lies in collective bargaining. Stronger trade unions and collective actors have the leverage to negotiate fair working conditions and formalize work-life balance at a macro level, removing the burden from the individual. When systemic boundaries are protected collectively, the individual need for quiet distancing vanishes. The law exists strictly to protect the baseline of human labor. If organizations want passion, engagement, and maximum output, they can no longer mandate it. Instead, they have to structurally earn it.